Marcus sat quietly in the back row of the Galactic Military Academy's Advanced Weapons Theory classroom, his human features making him stand out among the varied alien forms around him. The Centauri instructor, Professor Veltak, towered over the podium with his crystalline exoskeleton catching the artificial light as he gestured with 4 arms toward the holographic display. "Today we examine primitive projectile weapons," Veltak announced, his voice carrying the usual condescending tone reserved for discussing lesser technologies. These crude devices were abandoned by all civilized species once energy weapons were developed. Only the most backward cultures ever relied on such inefficient tools. A few students chuckled, and Marcus noticed several glances in his direction. Earth had only joined the Galactic Federation 50 years ago, making humans the newest and, supposedly most primitive member species. The other students came from civilizations that had mastered faster than light travel thousands of years before humans had even invented writing. "Professor," called out Zixara, a serpentine naga whose species had been spacefaring for over 10 millennia, "surely no intelligent species would waste time perfecting such obsolete technology when plasma rifles and neutron beams exist?" Veltak's mandibles clicked in what Marcus had learned was the Centauri equivalent of agreement. "Precisely, Miss Zixara. Advanced civilizations recognize that raw energy projection is always superior to hurling pieces of matter. It requires no skill, no understanding of physics beyond the most basic principles." Marcus raised his hand slowly. The classroom fell silent as all eyes turned to the lone human. Professor Veltak's compound eyes fixed on him with barely concealed disdain. "Yes, Cadet Chen? Do you wish to defend your species' quaint attachment to primitive weapons?" Standing up, Marcus kept his voice respectful despite the obvious mockery. "Professor, I was wondering if you might allow a practical demonstration. Sometimes seeing a concept in action helps understand its applications better than theory alone." A ripple of amusement passed through the classroom. Professor Veltak's exoskeleton shifted colors slightly, indicating what Marcus recognized as predatory satisfaction. The instructor clearly saw an opportunity to publicly humiliate the human student. "An interesting proposition, Cadet Chen. Very well. I hereby challenge you to demonstrate the supposed effectiveness of primitive projectile weapons using only materials available in this classroom. You have 30 minutes to construct and demonstrate a weapon that could pose any threat to a modern soldier equipped with standard defensive gear." The other students whispered excitedly among themselves. This was unprecedented. Professor Veltak was known for his rigid adherence to curriculum, never allowing practical exercises that weren't carefully planned and supervised. The human had somehow provoked him into an impromptu challenge. Marcus nodded calmly and walked to the front of the classroom. He began examining the available materials with systematic precision. The room contained standard educational furniture, polymer desks and chairs, a few decorative plants in containers, writing implements, data tablets, and various teaching aids. 30 minutes, Professor Veltak repeated, activating a holographic timer that began counting down. The class will observe how quickly primitive human instincts prove inadequate when confronted with the realities of advanced warfare. While the other students settled in to watch what they expected would be an embarrassing failure, Marcus continued his careful inventory. He picked up various items, testing their flexibility and strength. A polymer ruler bent satisfyingly in his hands. The cord from the window blinds felt strong enough to serve his purpose. One of the decorative plants had remarkably straight branches. "What exactly are you planning to construct?" Professor Veltak inquired, his tone dripping with skepticism. "A bow," Marcus replied simply, beginning to work with quiet efficiency. The classroom erupted in laughter. Even Professor Veltak's exoskeleton shifted to colors indicating amusement. A draconian student named Thexmore spoke up between his harsh chuckles. "A bow? You mean like the toys primitive hunters used before they discovered fire-based weapons?" "Professor, surely this doesn't constitute a serious demonstration." But Professor Veltak raised one of his arms for silence, his compound eyes focusing intently on Marcus's hands as the human continued working. There was something about the student's methodical movements, the quiet confidence in his actions, that made the instructor suddenly uncertain about his assumptions. Marcus had found what he needed. Now the real work would begin. Marcus worked with the focused intensity that his human ancestors had perfected over thousands of generations. His hands moved with practiced precision as he carefully stripped the bark from a branch he'd taken from one of the decorative plants. The wood underneath was harder than he'd hoped, but flexible enough to serve his purpose. The other students watched with growing curiosity as their initial amusement faded. Whatever primitive nonsense the human was attempting, he clearly knew what he was doing. His movements carried the confidence of someone who had performed these actions many times before. Using a small utility knife from the classroom's emergency kit, Marcus began shaping the wood. Each cut was deliberate and economical. He notched the ends of the branch carefully, testing the curve as he worked. The polymer ruler he'd examined earlier would provide additional spring tension when laminated to the wooden core. Fascinating, murmured Dr. Cathala, the Eluvian observer who served as the Academy's xenobiology specialist. She had been quietly taking notes in the corner, but Marcus's methodical approach had captured her attention. The human appears to be constructing a composite projectile launcher using tension-based energy storage. Professor Veltak's mandibles clicked nervously. Surely you don't suggest this crude assembly could pose any actual threat? Marcus continued his work without looking up. The cord from the window blinds required careful preparation. Too much tension would snap it, too little would render the weapon useless. He tested various sections, finding the optimal length and thickness. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory from those summers spent in the Montana wilderness, learning skills that most of Earth considered obsolete. Why would a modern human know such ancient techniques? Zixara asked, genuine curiosity replacing her earlier mockery. My grandfather was a traditional bowyer, Marcus explained as he worked, his voice carrying a note of pride. He believed that understanding our ancestors' tools helped us understand ourselves. Every human child on Earth learns basic survival skills, including primitive weapon construction. We call it staying connected to our roots. The draconian student, Thexmore, snorted dismissively. Primitive nostalgia. My people abandoned such crude methods 12,000 years ago when we developed plasma technology. But Dr. Cathala was studying Marcus with increasing fascination. Cadet Chen, what is the effective range of such a weapon? Marcus paused in his work, considering. That depends on many factors. The bow I'm making here is improvised from suboptimal materials, so perhaps 50 meters accurately. A properly made longbow with good arrows can be effective at over 300 meters. The classroom fell silent. 300 meters was well within the range of modern personal shield generators, but it also represented a significant tactical distance. Professor Veltak's exoskeleton had shifted to colors that Marcus didn't recognize, but Dr. Cathala's expression suggested the Centauri was experiencing some form of distress. Impossible. A primitive projectile weapon cannot achieve such range with any meaningful accuracy. The English longbow at the Battle of Agincourt had a maximum range of nearly 400 meters, Marcus replied calmly as he began laminating the polymer ruler to his wooden stave using adhesive from a classroom repair kit. Of course, that was with proper materials and years of training. This is just a demonstration model. He was now working on the string, carefully braiding several strands of the cord together to create the optimal thickness and strength. The process required patience, but his hands worked automatically while his mind calculated draw weight and arrow specifications. The projectiles, Dr. Cathala observed. How do you plan to construct effective projectiles? Marcus smiled for the first time since the challenge began. That's where human ingenuity really shows, Doctor. My people have been making arrows from whatever materials were available for over 40,000 years. You learn to improvise. He moved to one of the student desks and began disassembling a stylus. The metal shaft was nearly perfect, straight, balanced, and dense enough to carry significant kinetic energy. The polymer tip would need modification, and he'd have to improvise fletching from paper, but the basic arrow was achievable. Professor Veltak's timer showed 12 minutes remaining. The instructor's confidence was clearly shaken, though he tried to maintain his dismissive attitude. Even assuming you can create some form of projectile launcher, modern defensive systems render such weapons completely obsolete. Marcus looked up from his work, meeting the professor's compound gaze directly. Professor, when was the last time you updated the defensive protocols in your personal shield generator? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and, suddenly, every student in the classroom realized that something very interesting was about to happen. The question about shield generator updates clearly struck a nerve. Professor Veltak's exoskeleton flickered through several color patterns that Marcus recognized as agitation and uncertainty. Like most beings who had grown comfortable with advanced technology, the Centauri hadn't considered the specific parameters of his defensive systems in years. Standard military shields are designed to deflect energy weapons and high-velocity projectiles, Professor Veltak said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. They automatically adjust to counter any detected threat. Marcus nodded while continuing his work on the improvised arrow. That's true, Professor. Modern shields are incredibly sophisticated. They can stop plasma bolts, neutron beams, even railgun slugs traveling at significant fractions of light speed. The detection algorithms are remarkable. Dr. Kethala leaned forward in her chair, her scientific curiosity fully engaged. But, you seem to suggest there might be limitations to such systems? Every system has limitations, Marcus replied, carefully balancing his improvised arrow on his finger to check its center of mass. The question is whether those limitations matter in practical application. He had finished constructing his bow, and the weapon looked surprisingly professional despite its improvised origins. The laminated wood and polymer created an elegant curve, and the braided cord showed proper tension when he tested the draw. Several students had moved closer to get a better view, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine interest. Modern shield generators, Marcus continued, beginning his demonstration preparation, are calibrated to stop projectiles above certain velocity thresholds. They're designed for battlefield conditions where threats move fast enough to trigger automatic defensive responses. Zixera's serpentine form coiled with interest. Are you suggesting that slower projectiles might not activate defensive systems? Not exactly, Marcus said, knocking his arrow and drawing the bowstring back in one smooth motion. Every eye in the classroom focused on his movements. I'm suggesting that modern warfare has become so focused on overwhelming firepower that we've forgotten about precision and timing. Professor Veltak had activated his personal shield generator as a precaution, and the faint blue shimmer around his exoskeleton confirmed that his defensive systems were running at full power. Proceed with your demonstration, Cadet Chen. I'm curious to see how primitive technology fares against advanced defensive systems. Marcus drew the arrow back to full draw, his form textbook perfect despite the improvised nature of his equipment. The bow creaked slightly under the tension, but held steady. He aimed carefully at a target he had selected, not Professor Veltak himself, but the data tablet the instructor was holding. The key, Marcus said, his voice calm despite the 50 pounds of draw weight he was maintaining, is understanding that shields are reactive systems. They respond to threats based on predetermined parameters. Dr. Kethala was frantically taking notes. What parameters specifically? Velocity, primarily. Energy output. Threat assessment algorithms look for the signatures of known weapons. But, a wooden arrow moving at subsonic speeds? Marcus paused, his aim steady on the target. That's not a recognized threat pattern in most modern defensive systems. The timer showed 3 minutes remaining. Professor Veltak's mandibles clicked nervously, but he maintained his position. Demonstrate your theory, Cadet. Marcus released the arrow in one fluid motion. The projectile flew across the classroom with a soft whisper, moving at perhaps 60 meters per second, fast enough to be dangerous, but slow enough to slip beneath the velocity threshold of the shield generator's automatic response systems. The arrow struck Professor Veltak's data tablet with enough force to crack the screen and knock the device from his hands. The shield generator, designed to stop hypersonic projectiles and energy weapons, had completely ignored the wooden arrow as it passed through the defensive field without triggering any response. The classroom erupted in shocked silence. Professor Veltak stared at his damaged tablet, his exoskeleton cycling through colors that Marcus couldn't interpret. Dr. Kethala was scribbling notes furiously, her excitement obvious. Impossible, Thexmore whispered. How did a primitive weapon penetrate advanced shields? Marcus lowered his bow, his expression serious. Because sometimes the most sophisticated solution isn't the best solution. My ancestors survived 40,000 years of evolution by being adaptable, innovative, and willing to use whatever tools worked, regardless of how primitive others might consider them. The implications of what they had just witnessed began to sink in throughout the classroom. If a hastily constructed bow could defeat modern shields, what other assumptions about human primitiveness might be dangerously wrong? The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Professor Veltak finally spoke, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and growing concern. This must be a fluke. Shield generators are tested against thousands of different projectile types. A simple wooden arrow cannot represent a genuine vulnerability in modern defensive systems. Dr. Kethala looked up from her notes, her expression thoughtful. Professor, with respect, when were those tests conducted? And, what projectile types were included in the evaluation protocols? Marcus remained standing at the front of the classroom, still holding his improvised bow. He could see the wheels turning in the minds of his fellow students as they began to grasp the broader implications of what they had witnessed. The testing protocols, Professor Veltak said, consulting his damaged tablet despite the cracked screen, include railgun projectiles, plasma bolts, particle beams, kinetic penetrators, shaped charges, and various forms of explosive ordnance. The shield generators are rated to stop any known military projectile. Known military projectiles, Marcus repeated quietly. When was the last time any galactic military encountered arrows in combat? Zixara uncoiled slightly, her serpentine form showing signs of agitation. You're suggesting that our defensive systems have a blind spot for obsolete weapons? Not just obsolete weapons, Marcus corrected. Any weapon system that operates outside the expected parameters. My people have a saying, the enemy gets a vote. No matter how perfect you think your defenses are, someone will eventually find a way around them. Thexmore, the draconian student, stood abruptly. His reptilian features showed the kind of aggressive concern that his species was known for. This is absurd. Are you claiming that primitive human weapons could pose a threat to modern galactic forces? Marcus considered the question carefully. I'm not claiming anything. I'm demonstrating that assumptions can be dangerous, especially when they're based on technological superiority rather than tactical understanding. Dr. Kethala had moved to examine the damaged tablet, running her scanner over the impact point. The kinetic energy transfer is remarkable. The arrow delivered approximately 40 joules of force to a target area of less than 1 square centimeter. That's enough to penetrate standard body armor at close range. The implications were staggering. Every student in the classroom was beginning to realize that their understanding of primitive versus advanced weaponry might be fundamentally flawed. If humans still maintain knowledge of ancient weapons that could bypass modern defenses, what else might they know? Professor Veltak's exoskeleton had settled into a dull gray color that Marcus recognized as deep thought or concern. Cadet Chen, explain to me how many humans possess knowledge of such primitive weapons construction. All of us, Marcus replied simply. Basic survival skills are mandatory education on Earth. Every human learns to construct tools and weapons from available materials. We consider it essential knowledge. Every human? Dr. Kethala repeated, her voice carrying new respect. Your entire species maintains traditional combat skills alongside modern technology? Marcus nodded. We learned early in our history that technology can fail. Wars can cut off supply lines. Equipment can be destroyed or lost. But knowledge and adaptability, those travel with you wherever you go. Zixara was coiling and uncoiling nervously. How many other primitive human capabilities might be tactically relevant in modern warfare? Tracking and stealth techniques that don't rely on electronic systems. Improvised explosives from common materials. Hand-to-hand combat methods designed for beings without natural weapons or armor. Psychological warfare techniques that work on species regardless of their technological advancement. Marcus paused, letting the list sink in. Humans have been fighting each other for millennia. We've gotten very good at it. The classroom had become completely quiet except for the soft sound of Dr. Kethala's continued note-taking. Professor Veltak seemed to be processing information that challenged his fundamental assumptions about primitive versus advanced civilizations. Professor, Marcus said respectfully, may I ask what combat experience the major galactic species have with peer-level opponents? The question hung in the air like a weapon itself. Professor Veltak's mandibles clicked slowly as he considered his response. Most galactic conflicts have been asymmetric. Advanced species engaging with significantly less developed civilizations. When was the last time any galactic military faced an opponent with comparable technology but different tactical approaches? Professor Veltak's exoskeleton shifted through several color patterns before settling on what Marcus had learned indicated uncertainty or discomfort. Perhaps, several thousand years. The galactic peace has been maintained through technological superiority and mutual deterrence. Marcus nodded slowly. My species has been at war with ourselves for our entire recorded history. We've never had the luxury of assuming technological superiority. We've had to innovate, adapt, and find advantages wherever we could find them. The timer had long since expired, but no one in the classroom was paying attention to it anymore. They were all beginning to realize that their newest member species might not be as primitive as they had assumed, and that might be a very serious problem. Dr. Cathala set down her note-taking device and looked directly at Marcus with an expression he had never seen from any of his instructors, genuine respect mixed with something that might have been concern. Cadet Chen, I believe this demonstration has revealed something far more significant than Professor Veltak intended. Professor Veltak's exoskeleton flickered through multiple color patterns as he struggled to process the implications of what he had witnessed. His assumptions about human primitiveness had been shattered in the space of 30 minutes, and the tactical ramifications were becoming clear. I need to file a report with the Academy's Strategic Assessment Division, he said slowly. This represents a potential gap in our defensive doctrine that requires immediate evaluation. Marcus began disassembling his improvised bow, carefully setting aside the components. Professor, I should mention that this was a very basic demonstration. Human military history includes significantly more sophisticated primitive weapons and tactics. Thexmore's reptilian features showed genuine alarm. More sophisticated? How much more sophisticated? Compound bows with effective ranges exceeding 500 meters. Crossbows capable of penetrating heavy armor. Siege engines that could breach fortifications. Chemical weapons derived from common materials. Psychological warfare techniques refined over thousands of conflicts. Marcus paused, meeting the eyes of each student in turn. And that's just the historical knowledge. Modern human special forces train extensively in improvised weapons and unconventional tactics. Zixera's serpentine form had coiled into what Marcus recognized as a defensive posture. Your species maintains military units specifically trained in primitive combat methods? We maintain military units trained in every form of combat we've ever developed, Marcus corrected. Humans don't abandon useful knowledge just because we've developed newer methods. We add to our capabilities rather than replacing them. Dr. Cathala was rapidly calculating something on her personal device. Cadet Chen, how large is Earth's military force? Approximately 50 million active personnel across all services, Marcus replied. Plus another 200 million trained reserves who maintain basic combat readiness. The number struck the classroom like a physical blow. Most galactic civilizations maintain token military forces numbering in the thousands, relying primarily on technological superiority and automated defense systems. The idea of a species that kept hundreds of millions of sentients trained for warfare was unprecedented in modern galactic society. Professor Veltak had begun pacing, his forearms gesticulating as he processed the information. This changes everything. If humans possess tactical knowledge that can circumvent our defensive systems, and they maintain such large military forces. Professor, Marcus interrupted gently, I think you're misunderstanding something important. Humans didn't join the Galactic Federation because we needed protection or because we were primitive. We joined because we believed in the ideals of peaceful cooperation between species. But, you maintained your military capabilities, Zixera observed. Of course. Peace is only possible when you're strong enough to defend it, Marcus replied. My people learned long ago that hoping for peace while being unable to fight for it is just wishful thinking. Dr. Cathala had been quietly reviewing her notes throughout this exchange. Now she looked up with an expression that Marcus couldn't quite interpret. Cadet Chen, I'm curious about something. When Earth applied to join the Galactic Federation, your species submitted technological and scientific assessments for evaluation. Were military capabilities included in those assessments? Marcus considered his response carefully. I believe Earth's application focused on our peaceful intentions and our potential contributions to galactic civilization. Our military capabilities weren't considered relevant to Federation membership. In other words, Professor Veltak said slowly, the Federation has no accurate assessment of human military capabilities. That would be correct, Professor. The classroom had become so quiet that Marcus could hear the soft hum of the environmental systems. Every student was staring at him with a mixture of fascination and growing alarm as they realized that their understanding of humanity's place in galactic civilization might be completely wrong. Professor Veltak stopped pacing and fixed all of his compound eyes on Marcus. Cadet Chen, in your assessment, how would human military forces fare against modern galactic armies? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the military aspects of the question, but the diplomatic implications of his answer. Finally, he spoke with the careful precision that had characterized his entire demonstration. "Professor, my species has a saying, speak softly and carry a big stick. We prefer peace, but we're very good at the alternative." The implications of that simple statement settled over the classroom like a shadow. In the space of one impromptu demonstration, everything the galactic community thought they knew about humanity had changed. The newest members of the Federation weren't primitive refugees seeking protection, they were a warrior species that had chosen cooperation over conquest. And Marcus Chen had just proven that choice might be more significant than anyone had realized.